There are lots of different kids' lives we've gone back and looked at and realized we didn't understand what they were going through 15 years ago and 20 years ago in Texas. One of the kids whose lives we went back and looked at, we realized she came in to the juvenile justice system in 2008. She was charged with assaulting her parent at home and running away from home. Over the next 5 years, she came back into court many times, including in the child welfare system because she'd been abused in her own home. During that period of time between 2008 and 2013, she was in court many times. She was moved from placement to placement because she was abusive and hostile every time she was placed in a new treatment center. She was rejected by her family that said they couldn't take care of her, and there were accusations made towards her by her family about whether or not she was criminally engaged in other activity, and none of her own family wanted to work with her and bring her back home. Ultimately, in hindsight, when we go back and look at all of the information we had at the time but didn't understand, no one knew how to ask her the right questions. No one knew how to get the information from her about what she had endured. And unfortunately, we didn't understand she was a victim. She came in originally into the juvenile justice system as someone that was committing crimes because we didn't understand how to approach her. Thankfully, over time, we've understood that we have to take a different approach with kids that have endured the level of trauma that human trafficking victims endure. We didn't understand how to talk to her. We didn't understand how to get her to open up and talk about her life experiences. One of the programs we created in 2012 in my county was a docket that allowed us to look at kids that were in the juvenile justice system and in the child welfare system. And we talked about those kids that were in both of those systems with all of the stakeholders that were involved, with the child welfare workers, with the juvenile probation officers, with their lawyers from both systems, with the prosecutors from both systems. And in sharing that information, we also understood that we still weren't able to understand what was going on because we were missing another valuable piece. And that was the leadership of having an organization that helped the community understand human trafficking. One of the things that we missed about this young lady was that there were people in her own family that were accusing her of being a prostitute. There were allegations that she herself were acting as a prostitute as a child. And there's no such thing as a child prostitute. No such thing. But we didn't understand the significance of that type of allegation from her own family back then. And when I say you can't be a child prostitute, all over the world, there are restrictions on fighting for your country, driving in your country, consuming alcohol in your country. Certainly, there should be restrictions on an age at which a child can consent to engaging in acts like that for money, and it's not proper. Kids that age cannot make those types of decisions. Because a child engaging in acts like that isn't doing it voluntarily. They're not doing it consensually. They're subject to being forced and coerced into doing those acts. And throughout that time period from 2008 to 2013, when this young girl was going from system to system and going to court, we had investigators, probation officers, law enforcement officials, school teachers, placement officials, lawyers. No one recognized those things, not even the judges that saw her in court. Many, many people had opportunities to interact with her. Many professionals had opportunities to interact with her and did interact with her. But no one understood what was going on in her world. No one understood what she had to endure. That's why in 2015, we took the steps to create, in my county, in McLennan County, what we called a coalition or a task force to bring everyone together. And I will tell you that when we sent out announcements inviting people to come and participate, we really didn't know who would come. We wondered if a few people would show up or a lot of people would show up, because no one had ever done anything like this. Within days of sending out an announcement inviting people to come, we had overwhelming response from schools, hospitals, medical clinics, law enforcement agencies, lawyers, child welfare workers, juvenile probation departments. So many people eagerly responded and attended. And what surprised us was the shared stories as we went around the room, where each of these stakeholders saw the level of abuse and neglect and victimization, but they didn't know what to call it. They were absolutely amazed that so many people just in our community had seen those things, but had no idea what they were actually seeing. It was a moving experience for all of us, because we just had no idea the depth of it in our own community. And all of us had so much experience working with kids for many, many years. From that initial meeting, we went forward and created that task force and continued to grow and invite more people under this tent so that we could share those experiences and information to combat human trafficking in our community. When we first started this endeavor in 2015, we really just thought that it would be the courts, the prosecutors, the child welfare workers, and the juvenile probation department. Like I said, we invited a lot of people and we just didn't expect them to come. The reality was in 2015, we just didn't know many people that were doing this. We kind of were out there in what we thought was an unknown territory. In hindsight, we'd like to think we were leaders in this particular type of development and operation. Not knowing any better, we gathered around kitchen tables, sat around couches, prayed over decisions, stumbled on decisions, fell, got back up, kept going. It wasn't perfect. It was messy. It was messy a lot of the time. When we first sent out the announcements and invited people to come visit with us in 2015, I'll be honest with you, a lot of people contacted me and asked me who I thought I was. Are you Liam Neeson? Are you filming Taken? What's going on over there? Because they had no idea what we meant when we said attacking human trafficking in our community. Their point of reference was the movie, Taken. They had no concept of what these victims were enduring day in and day out right inside our county. When they came into that meeting and we shared and announced who you were and introduced yourselves and where you're from, we were absolutely blown away by the stories that each of those individuals told. As we went around that room, person after person told a story about their exposure to a child that had been victimized and had been trafficked, but they didn't have a title for it. They didn't know what it was. They didn't even know who to call. By the end of that meeting, the response was overwhelming. Our community decided that we did need the organization and structure needed under the guidance of Unbound Now to combat human trafficking in our community. From that initial meeting, we went forward and continue to host meetings 4 times a year. All of the stakeholders that I've mentioned and even more wanted to come to the meetings. The meetings were standing room only at times, as so many people wanted to not only learn about human trafficking, but fight human trafficking. And they needed to know what role they could play in our community in making a difference. But the one thing we discovered in creating this coalition or task force in our community, but it's not about the number of individuals involved, and it's not about the number of resources that you have. What's important is that you have the desire to make that change, because it's possible, regardless of how large your community is or how small it is. If you've got stakeholders that want to change, you can do this. Because I assure you, we really didn't know what we were doing when we got into this. And we had to adapt and make many, many changes along the way. Don't let those frustrations and changes discourage you. because it's by adapting that you actually will get stronger in this fight. As our task force or coalition grew, what we discovered is we had to have more organization because, like I said, so many people wanted to be involved. We really hadn't expected all of the different levels of participation from all parts of our community. That was a challenging part of the operation, but it's one that ultimately paid dividends. But because by dividing people up into their area of interest and expertise, those folks in each of those categories became much better at their jobs. So all the schools that shared information with one another got better at identifying kids at risk in their schools. All the churches got better at identifying kids that came to church to see if maybe there wasn't something else going on that they didn't recognize. The medical professionals got better at understanding what was being said when kids would come to the doctor's office and what wasn't being said. Sometimes what is said is not as important as what the kids weren't saying, but we had to teach those stakeholders, and I say we had to teach. No, I didn't teach anybody any of these things. There were other professionals that knew how to explain and educate the importance of what kids were saying and what they weren't saying and how to reach them. Because the information that they have is information they didn't share with anyone. Knowing how to reach kids that are victims is not something you can just read about in a book. We had to have levels of training to show people how to access that information to help those kids.
So in 2020, we created the Tarrant County Human Trafficking Task Force. The Tarrant County Sheriff's Office took the lead on the law enforcement side, and Unbound Now took the lead on the victim service provider side. When we talked, we really felt there was a need for a more collaborative task force in Tarrant County. What we were seeing was really an underreporting of the incidences with our victims, thus resulting in the lack of identification and subsequent prosecution of traffickers. We also saw a lack of collaboration between law enforcement. Oftentimes, they were working within their silos, and they did not necessarily have the specific training to investigate human trafficking offenses. Thus, these cases often were very complex and thus resulted in either misidentification and or just a total missing of the offense, resulting in a trafficker not being prosecuted. The Tarrant County Human Trafficking Task Force is a multidisciplinary task force that brings together law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, victim service providers, and other governmental and non-governmental organizations to come together to address human trafficking in Tarrant County and then within the region. Our goals within the task force are to make sure that the victims have access to the wider range of services in order to begin their restoration. We're also doing a tremendous amount of work within our schools in order to not only to conduct education, but as a prevention method as well. The Fort Worth Independent School District has initiated a program that has curriculum that's age appropriate across a variety of grades. And it really brings together and educates those children about the dangers of human trafficking and exploitation, but also provides them the ability to engage with and talk openly about potential situations that they were involved in. One of the keys to success in the task force and as well as combating human trafficking is collaboration. Without it, we are not going to be effective. What we have seen that it truly is a community response to human trafficking in order to effectively combat it. With that being said, the task force has really done a tremendous job as far as building a very responsive community effort to combat human trafficking. There are 3 subcommittees within the task force. We have a law enforcement and prosecution subcommittee that brings all the partners together in law enforcement and prosecution to discuss cases, to strategize about with operations coming up, but also to hone in on maybe some specific training that local law enforcement is needing when it comes to human trafficking. We have our victim service provider subcommittee, which brings all of those victim service providers together, as well as other governmental, non-governmental organizations, to really pull together and identify the strengths and weaknesses with each organization as far as they're helping victims. We have a multitude of individuals that are wanting to come forward, and everybody has a specific place to or a role to play in this fight. But understanding each role is really important in that aspect. And then we have an outreach and training subcommittee that really again focuses on community outreach and really engagement with the community as far as having an education or an understanding of what human trafficking is. But it also provides, specific training to the community, to law enforcement, victim service providers, and really helps us be better prepared to combat human trafficking in Tarrant County and be more effective. I would say over the last 6 years, the victim identification has risen greatly. That's based off of a variety of reasons, within the task force, not only the collaboration, but also the training and the understanding of what human trafficking is. We're seeing more identification through law enforcement operations. We're seeing more identification through outreach operations, and we're seeing more identification through the education of the community. By them having a better understanding, they can recall a situation or instance that they saw that now looks like has the appearance to be human trafficking, and they're able to tell law enforcement about those situations and allow us to follow up on it.
Another practical thing that I would suggest is meet regularly. Communication is so important, and having open lines of communication for people to exchange information, to give information that they've learned, and to receive information from others. Not only to communicate, but to make connections. Knowing who to contact in this endeavor is so important. New people to this fight who've just come to learn about human trafficking have to know who to call. Learning who to contact is so important. It's not like you can go online and just find out who knows about human trafficking and who can help you pursue this. Going to those meetings and exchanging each other's contact information allows you to build a network in your community to make a difference. So have those meetings as frequently as needed. I would encourage you to set a schedule. Don't just do it randomly. At each meeting, set your next meeting and have a plan for those things in place going forward. Because it's that level of contact and communication, at least in our experience, that made a real difference in the network in our area. Because knowing who to call, knowing who to trust, knowing who can help in this fight is a huge piece of this puzzle. You have to have certain key people at the table, but they can make a difference when they meet regularly. And again, everyone can't be at every meeting. Don't be discouraged if attendance always isn't as large as you might want, because having the meetings as often is just as important as how many people come. Because having the commitment and dedication to continuing to meet and gather together is significant in showing your community that you're committed to making a difference in this effort. One of the things that we discovered changes is some people leave organizations. Juvenile probation officers would leave, lawyers might change, child welfare workers can change identity, and different people come in and out of those organizations. So having the continuity and the consistency of having meetings, make sure that you can continue to educate the people that follow those individuals into those jobs so that we don't have gaps in learning and gaps in education in this fight, because that continuity is significant and you can't overlook that.
One of the things that we have done that's been really helpful is having regularly scheduled meetings between key groups. So we have a coalition that meets quarterly, and the coalition has invited anybody and everybody who might have anything to do with trafficking, with the kids in the system, or any social service organization. And some of that has been sort of trial and error. For example, I talked about the massage parlor case where we realized, hey, we need to have an immigration attorney on board. So we started inviting her to these groups. And so as we work cases and from our failures, we realize, hey, the next time we need this person, let's invite them. But the coalition invites prosecutors, law enforcement, judges, defense attorneys, but also schools. There's an organization, a drop-in center for homeless youth, so they come. Unbound. Anybody who might have anything, juvenile probation, MHMR, which is our mental health services in the community, anybody who might have anything to do with helping these people in any way. We have a different meeting for cases before they get filed with the court system called MDT, which is Multidisciplinary Team. This includes law enforcement, the medical examiners for sexual assault exams, forensic interviewers, myself, so the DA's office, child welfare investigators. And we meet weekly to talk about new cases that have come in that week. And this is before they get sent over to the DA's office for filing. Some don't get sent, some do get sent. Sometimes we say, hey, we need more evidence there, or let's get a medical on this kiddo. And we sort of talk about cases as they're coming in on the front end. And that's also been very helpful. Especially because sometimes, with the nature of trafficking cases where they're moving people around a lot and it's kind of always on the go, you might have a detective in one jurisdiction who has a case on someone and a detective in another jurisdiction who has a case on that same person. And when they get to these MDT meetings, they sort of like, hey, I'm also working, and so they can compare notes. In the way our criminal justice system works, I'm going to end up getting both of their cases and I can combine them on my desk, when I get them and I'm taking it to the grand jury. But if they can figure that out at the beginning and work it from the front end as a trafficking case, it makes the whole thing much more efficient. Sometimes we have collaboration meetings for specific cases. So we have regularly scheduled meetings for cases that might be trafficking, on the front end before they come into the office or as they're pending. But sometimes we also have meetings with our detectives about cases that they're working that are trafficking cases that they want our input on before they do their sting, before they do the arrest. And that's been helpful too, because we're learning. And so we were able to say, hey, that last time when we did this, that was really great. Or that last time, I really wish we had this piece of evidence. Can you get that information before you send it over? Because like I said, the evidence disappears or it's not going to be there 3 years later when I'm trying to try this case. So I have the courtroom perspective. I'm looking at it from what do I need to prove this to a jury? What do I need to prove this from a judge? And they're looking at it from what do I need to make the arrest? And they're slightly different. And so being able to combine those perspectives at the beginning has been really helpful on a case-specific basis as well. That having a victim-centered approach has been the best tool. And I had a case a few years ago where this was super evident. We had a child welfare case where 2 girls, 14 and 16 years old, came into the CPS system. Their parents were using drugs. The mom was out of the picture. She was off in another state and hadn't lived with the kids for years. Nobody could find her. The father was heavy into methamphetamine and his girlfriend as well. And there was domestic violence between the father and his girlfriend in the home. So that's the reason the kiddos were removed. It wasn't for trafficking and it wasn't for sexual abuse. There were some red flags for us, however. First of all, just the fact that they were in the child welfare system we know is it's a high risk factor. But they said that the drug dealer for the dad gave him his meth for free. Nobody gives meth away for free. That's not a thing. So immediately we were like, okay, something's going on here. And we did some more digging, but at the very beginning, we gave the girls forensic interviews, which is the process that we have at our advocacy center that we use to investigate, to talk to children who have either been victims or witnesses of crimes, instead of the detectives interviewing them. But they didn't make an outcry of abuse, of sexual abuse, of trafficking, or anything like that. But we thought, okay, this seems really fishy. So we worked it as a trafficking case. So one thing that we know from the research and from experience working these cases is that children are very reluctant to disclose the depth of their abuse until they've achieved felt safety. So we started looking at how can we achieve that for these girls? What can we do to help them? So, of course, we got them into counseling right away. We were able to find a counselor who had specific training in dealing with victims of human trafficking. Even though this technically wasn't labeled as a trafficking case yet, we had our suspicions, so we went ahead and did that. We found out that the drug dealer gave the dad his meth for free. Then we found out as long as he could spend time with the girls, that's what he wanted in exchange for his meth. And so then we were very, we knew, okay, this has got to be trafficking. And so we found out the girls would spend large amounts of time with this person. And at first they were saying, oh, he's a family friend. He's very nice. He helps us out a lot. When our dad and his girlfriend are fighting, he'll come over and he'll take us away from that. And so he was seeing a need. He was seeing that these kids were living in a home with domestic violence, and he was swooping in as the hero. And that's kind of how it started, right? Like he was, let me help you. I'll take you away from here. You can come to my house where there's no fighting. And so that was another red flag, because we know that that's often how traffickers start relationships, start with their grooming their victims. But then we found out that they were actually very scared of him. So as they were in their foster home for a little longer, we found out that there was a lot of fear. He would drive through their neighborhood or send other people to drive through their neighborhood. And we didn't know how he had figured out where they lived until we figured out that he bought them iPads and iPhones, and he was using the location services on that to identify where they were and where they went to school and things like that. So we took those away, obviously, and we got the sheriff's office in that county to jump on board. And obviously there was no criminal investigation at that point. There was no crime that we could definitively say was happening, but they just did patrols in the neighborhood. Another thing that we did was they started saying that they started expressing fears about, he's sending me a message on Facebook telling me he liked that red shirt that I wore to school today. And that really freaked them out. And so we got an organization called BACA, which stands for Bikers Against Child Abuse, on board. And the BACA, this group, they had about 10 to 15 people in their big motorcycle vests, and they brought their motorcycles and just camped out in front of the girl's house. And it was great because they say their day and night, they were just there in front of the house, standing guard. When the kids got on the school bus to go to school, the BACA motorcyclists drove around the bus and just gave them an escort to school, and then they stayed at school all day. And then they drove them home, or they stayed at practice. If the girls had practice, BACA was at practice. And that really helped to give the girls a sense of security because they basically had this, it looks like a motorcycle gang, but they're just the most gentle people you've ever met. And so we got BACA involved. We also got the school involved. We told them kind of what was going on. Hey, this is a situation. So they allowed for BACA to be on their campus. And also, normally in child welfare cases, even if a parent doesn't have custody of their children, as long as their rights haven't been terminated, they're allowed to get information about their kiddos, how they're doing in school, or their medical checkups and things like that. So we started limiting the access that the parent had to information from the school regarding where they would be. We found out both of the dad and the drug dealer, we were calling him the dealer at this point because we knew he was a trafficker, but we couldn't label him like that yet, were locked up in our county jail in cells very close to each other. So they were feeding each other information about the girls. CPS was supposed to give the father updates, regular updates about his kids, photos, things like that. That's very normal because generally the point of a CPS case is to rectify whatever situation brought the kids into care and then work towards reuniting the family. And so that includes maintaining contact between parent and child. So we had to cut that off, obviously, because the trafficker was ending up with these photos that we were sending to dad of the girls. We also got the jail staff involved, told them about what was going on, and they were able to separate these two guys and limit any communication that they had. So this was a real team effort. We got BACA, we got the schools, we got the jail, we got the sheriff's office in another county. We got the counselor with specially trained background for working with trafficking victims. And I had a phenomenal CPS caseworker who was aware of these dynamics as well. And she worked really closely with me, and I was able to work with her on, okay, we know it's a trafficking case, but we just have to wait for them to be ready. They're not going to disclose until they're ready to disclose what's happened to them. After about 4 or 5 months of this, the girls finally were able to tell their caseworker, hey, by the way, when I was spending all this time with him, we were going to hotels, we were having sex, he was, grooming me to sell, he would take me on drug deals, they gave all the information that we needed to be able to charge him as a trafficker. And so then we got our sheriff's office involved and wrapped up the case with a little bow and handed it over to the sheriff, and they were able to prosecute or make an arrest on this drug dealer as a trafficker. And he pled a few years ago. I think he's serving a few 15-year sentences on that. So that was really great, but it was only possible because we were able to focus on the children first, kind of get everybody on board. How can we serve these girls? And eventually out of that, we got a trafficking case. So that's just an example of the benefits of collaboration across all fronts, because that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't gotten all those folks on board.